Good afternoon, it's Nerfcraft, and this is Dameon's level 3 upgrade. So as you can see, Dameon is quite filthy in a lot of places. I've never actually properly cleaned him out. Haven't gone in and thoroughly cleaned him. So, first part of this upgrade, I'm going to disassemble everything. So first thing I'm going to do is remove all 4 shocks. That's just one screw up top, and one screw at bottom for all of them. 2 on the front and 2 on the back. These shocks have now been removed. Keep in mind when you take off the rear shocks not to lose the little washers that come at the top. Right there. Also, if you're using the plastic bushings, be careful not to use those. To lose those. And as you can see, my shock tower was already free when I pulled off the shocks, so that just came right off. Normally, to remove this, you just have to unscrew these 2 screws and these 2 screws, which will be holding the top of the transmission to the top of the chassis. And then you'd have to remove 2 screws from the back side, which would hold in the camber links. I've already done that because I tried to upgrade Dameon before, upgrade his camera links, but sadly they broke. But the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove all the tires just to make this a little bit easier, as well as the front bumper. The wheels, you just pull off, you just unscrew that nut with the 4-way wrench and then pull off the tire. The front bumper is only held in with 2 screws. Now that the tires and the bumper have been removed, I'm going to go ahead and remove the waterproof receiver box, as well as the ESC and ESC plate. ESC comes off with 2 screws. The plate just has 4 screws under the ESC, and the receiver box just has 2 screws on one on each side. Now that those have been removed, I'm going to go ahead and remove the motor and spur gear, as well as the slipper clutch. The motor just has 2 screws, one on top, one on bottom, and the spur gear, you just need to take out that center nut. I actually took off the spur gear from the slipper clutch before, so I'm going to actually put those back in because I don't think I need to disassemble the whole slipper clutch. It shouldn't be that dirty. The motor, spur gear, and slipper clutch have now been removed. So next thing I'm going to do is remove this rear bumper. There would normally be a screw on that side. There will also be a screw down there, a screw in the middle there. Now the rear bumper has been removed. So now I can remove the 4 pins on the A-arm. 2 on this side at the very end and right there by the transmission, and 2 on the other side. Now that the rear A-arms have been removed, I'm going to go ahead and just slide off these half shafts from both sides. And now all I'm going to do is I'm going to take off this hex adapter, remove the pin under it, as well as the Teflon washers if they're still there. And then I'm going to pull the drive shaft out. And now that those have been disassembled, I can remove the other half shafts from the transmission by removing the little screw on the output yoke right there on both sides. And now those drive shafts have been removed as well. That part of the drive shaft. So now I can remove those 6 screws and pull off the rear transmission. Now that the transmission has been removed, I'm going to go ahead and unscrew all of those screws, but I'm not going to pull the transmission apart. I've been inside the transmission recently enough to clean up the gears and re-grease them and everything that I don't think it's really necessary today. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove those screws. Now all the screws have been removed. Be careful to keep track of the smallest screw. It's important that you don't mix it up, because that needs to go back into this hole right here, because otherwise you're going to poke through the other side of the transmission box, and I've done this, and you're going to end up with a hole there. So make sure you know which screw goes where. Now that that's done, I'm going to go ahead and use the 4-way wrench to remove these little posts here, and I'm going to go ahead and remove the 3 screws that are currently holding in the upper deck. Normally there'd be 4 because there would be one right here, but that got lost, so I'm not going to put it in. I'm not going to put it in right now. I'm just going to take the others off. Now that the upper deck has been removed, I'm going to go ahead and remove that screw which holds on the steering linkage to the steering knuckle on both sides, and finish pulling the upper chassis out from the rest of the truck. Now that the upper chassis deck has been removed, I'm going to unscrew that center screw that holds on the servo saver, as well as the 4 screws that are holding on the servo. Now the servo has been removed, and you can see even that is filthy. Also, it looks like I had pinched the wire by accident, because you can see that they are frayed and destroyed. I'm going to have to see what I can do about that, but that's dangerous. So maybe I can put some E-tape on it or something, but we'll see. Now I'm going to remove these 2 screws, being careful not to lose the washers, and being careful to keep them in the same order. And once I remove those, I can pull the whole steering bell crank assembly off from the upper chassis. Now the upper chassis is completely independent, so I can set that off to the side and get to work on the steering bell cranks. All I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all these screws that hold on all the linkages, as well as the servo saver. And I'm going to pop out the little bushings on the steering bell cranks as well. The steering bell cranks have now been completely disassembled, so I can bring back the rest of Dameon's chassis. And the first thing I'm going to do is remove those 3 screws at the bottom that hold on the front bulkhead. And the main chassis has now been separated, so now we can set it back off to the side. And we're going to start by taking off the A-arms. So just 2 screw pins, which I have put in through the rear, that goes through the bulkhead. And then 1 screw pin on each side that holds in the A-arm to the caster block. Now that the A-arms have been removed, I can remove the front body post by removing those 2 screws. I'm also going to remove the 2 bottom screws to separate them from the rest of the assembly. And I'm going to undo the 4 shoulder screws that hold the camber links in place. So now that the camber links and front body posts have been removed, I can now take the shock tower off of the bulkhead by unscrewing those 2 screws. Now that those are separated, we can separate the caster blocks and steering knuckles by unscrewing that screw pin right there. Now that those are taken apart, I realize that the pins are bent, but I don't think we have any spares, so there's nothing I can really do about that right now. Probably going to have to get some upgraded STRC ones later. But now we can pull off the hex adapter from the front steering knuckles, as well as the pin and the Teflon washer, and pull out the axle pin. And the truck is finally disassembled. That is a lot of parts. So now that everything's disassembled, it's time to get cleaning. So this is going to take a while, so I'll see you guys in a little while. Well, everything has finally been cleaned up a little bit. I also have a new set of plastic camber links that I'm going to be using, since the other ones that I got from Atomic RC did not work out. But it's time to reassemble everything. However, I'm not going to be using the same screws.
Upstairs is a mess.
Because I have this package. So included in the Tony Screws kit is their business card, some custom Tony Screws stickers, and of course all different types of screws. They also include 3mm nuts, as well as a few different sizes of washers. They also include 4mm nuts. So enough talk, let's get this truck back together. So I think I'm actually going to go ahead and show how I choose to use the screws. So this is the 3x20mm button head screws. They include 5 of them, so I'm going to use that for the transmission. Normally you'd have 4 of the normal size ones, and then one that's slightly shorter that would go right in that hole. However, these are all slightly shorter than the other ones, so it does not matter where you put each of them. So I'm going to put them in those 3 holes at the bottom left corner, as well as the 2 holes up top there. I'm going to be using the same screws for the wheelie bar mount that I did before though. So let's go ahead and get this installed. So now that the transmission screws are installed and looking beautiful, I'm going to put a little piece of E-tape to cover up the bottom gear, because for whatever reason I didn't have one on there before. I'm not sure why. But I'm going to go ahead and get a piece of electrical tape and cover that up. And now that's covered up, so now that I'm done with the transmission, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the old transmission screws and I'm going to go ahead and put them back in the bag so that I can hold on to them as spares or maybe for another project. Next, I'm going to put the transmission into the chassis. So all I need to do is just place it into the back. And now I need to find the screws for it, so I'll be right back. So the screws that you're going to need for holding in the transmission are the 4x12mm flathead screws. These are the large countersunk ones. You're also going to need the 3x12mm flathead screws, which are the smaller countersunk screws. So you need to put 4 larger ones in the large holes, and then the 2 smaller ones in those 2 holes at back. Those are slightly smaller holes. So I'll show you once that's been installed. So the 4x12mm screws have been installed, and now the 3x12mm screws have been installed. So now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the rear A-arms. I'm using the same screw pins as before, so there's no change there. So now I'm going to go ahead and install a new rear shock tower using the 3x10mm button head screws. The reason I'm using a new one is because I had drilled one of the holes on the old one. And since I'm using the plastic camber links again, I can't use that hole. So, new shock tower. So now we can reinstall the rear shocks. I'm going to use the same screws up top, but I'm going to have to figure out which screws I should use on bottom. So the top of the shocks have now been installed using the same stainless steel screws as before. And for the bottom of the shocks, I'm going to use the 3x12mm button head screws and mount them on the outermost position of the A-arm. And now the bottom of the shocks have been installed. So next I'm going to have to put the rear camber links onto the shock tower on the lower mounting holes. And the rear camber links have been installed. So now I'm going to go ahead and put in the rear axle carriers using the same Traxxas pins. Now that the rear axle carriers have been installed, I'm going to go ahead and put on the half shaft that goes onto the outputs of the differential gear from the transmission. And now I'm going to install the other side half shafts. Now I can put back the Teflon washer, the cross pin, and the hex adapter. And now I can put the shoulder screws through the other side of the camber links and into the top of the axle carriers. Now I'm going to reinstall the rear bumper using the same screws as before, and later I'll just find whatever extra button head screws I have to put in on the other side. Now I'm going to reinstall the slipper clutch by putting the pin through the hole in the shaft there. Then I'm going to put the back plate on, fitting it over the pin. And then I'm going to put the little metal washer plate on that, and then I'm going to screw the spur gear back onto it. And I'm going to tighten it all the way down and then loosen it half a turn. And now I'm going to put the battery hold down post back into their holes. So now that the battery posts have been installed, I'm going to go ahead and put on the ESC plate. So to hold down the ESC plate, I'm going to need to use a 3x8mm button head screws. And I'll need 4 of those. Now that that's installed, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the waterproof receiver box. So I am going to be using the Tony Screws 3x8mm cap head screw. And now that the bottom of the receiver box has been installed, I'm going to go ahead and put together the rest of it. I'm going to use stainless steel screws to hold the top half of the receiver box to the bottom half. and I'm going to use a stock Traxxas screws to hold the top tie bar down. So now it's time to reassemble the upper chassis with the steering bell cranks. So now I need to take these metal bushings and put 2 into each of these white bell cranks, one on top and one on bottom. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the steering bell cranks onto the upper chassis, so the extra arm should stick out to the left, because if it sticks out to the right, then the top part of this would go backwards. So make sure that the part with the extra arm goes to the left, and that's where it's going to link up to the servo, and then the one with only one arm goes on the right. So now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the screws, but the old screws and washers got rusted, so I'm going to instead install some new screws and washers, including the 3mm SS washers and the 3x30mm cap heads. These are the ones that have the straight shaft on them. So what you want to do is you want to start by putting on one of the smaller washers onto the screw, and then put the larger washer over that, and then screw that into the steering bell crank. So I'll be right back when that's done. Now we can reinstall the center link onto the middle of the steering bell cranks using these stranger shoulder screws from before. So now that the steering bell cranks have been reinstalled, I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the servo. It's right here. I'm going to use the same stainless steel screws that were in there before. Now I'm going to attach the servo arm linkage back to the steering bell cranks using a 3x12mm button head screw. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the servo saver back onto the other end of the linkage using a 3x16mm button head screw and a 3mm nut. So now I'm going to reattach the servo saver to the servo using the same stainless steel screw as before. Normally you would need to center the servo, but I don't have all the electronics for Dameon because most of them are screwed up. So for now, I'm just going to have to go with this. I can center the servo later. So the 3x16mm button head screw is just a hair too long for the servo saver. It just touches the upper deck. But we don't want that, so I'm going to go ahead and just use a 3x12mm button head screw for that purpose. So the screw that I was going to use for the servo is stripping out, so I'm going to go ahead and replace that with one of the TSK 3x8mm button head screws. Now I'm going to go ahead and put the steering linkages back onto the steering bell cranks using a couple of 3x12mm button head screws. And now the part that I've really been excited about, installing this upper deck onto the rest of this chassis. But first, I need to take care of the bulkhead assembly. So I'm going to screw the front shock tower back into the bulkhead using these 3x16mm button head screws. Now I'm going to install the mount for the body posts using the 3x12mm button head screws. Now I'm going to go ahead and reinstall the body posts themselves using the 3x8mm button head screws. I am now going to screw the bulkhead into the lower part of the chassis using the 4x15mm flathead countersunk screws. Now I can reinstall the upper chassis deck by simply sliding it into place, making sure that the steering linkages go off to the sides. I also need to make sure that I do not pinch the servo wire like I did last time, because that will ruin the wires, and I just fixed these and I do not feel like having them ruined again. So you just need to seat that, then use the 4x12mm countersunk screws right here, as well as the 3x12mm screws. So now that the upper chassis deck has been installed, I can reinstall the front A-arms using the same screw pins as before. Now that my A-arms are reinstalled, I can reinstall the top of the front shocks using the same stainless steel screws that I had in there before. Now I can reinstall the bottom of the shocks using a 3x16mm button head screw. Now that the bottom of the shocks have been reinstalled, I can go ahead and reinstall the front camber links using some shoulder screws. So while reinstalling the camber links behind the shock tower, I also used some 3mm SS washers, just one on each side. Now I can reassemble the caster blocks and steering knuckles using the same screw pins as before. Now these screw pins that I have are bent, so sometime very soon I'm going to have to get some new ones. But for now, I can't bend them back because I've just had too many experiences with them breaking trying to do that. So for now, I'm just going to have to use them as it is. As you can see, the bent pins are preventing the steering knuckles and caster blocks to slide freely through each other. The steering knuckle should be able to just fall back and forth. If I press it, it will move, but it takes a lot of force. Way more than it should. So this is why you need to get this replaced, because this will burn out your servo in about 5 minutes. It's just way too stressful for it. So probably going to be like the next upgrade. Now we can go ahead and put the caster blocks and steering knuckles back into the A-arms. Make sure the left one goes on the left side and the right one goes on the right side. Now I can put the axle pins back through the steering knuckles, put on a Teflon washer, place the cross pin through the hole, and snap on the hex adapter. Now I can connect the other end of the steering linkage to the steering knuckle using a 3x16mm button head screw, as well as a 3mm nut. Now I can reinstall the camber links to the top of the caster blocks using a shoulder screw, and I'm going to put on a 3mm nut on the other side. Now that the camber links have been installed, I can reinstall the front bumper using some 4x12mm flathead countersunk screws. Now it's time to reinstall the motor. To do this, instead of putting in the old screws again, which are starting to get worn out, I'm going to use some 3x8mm button head screws, as well as 3mm large SS washers that I just dropped. These ones right here. So let's go ahead and get the motor installed and meshed with the gear properly. Now that the motor has been reinstalled, we can reinstall the gear cover. To install the gear cover, I'm going to use the 3x6mm button head screws. And now all that's left to do is reinstall the tires. I can just use the same nuts as before. I don't need any new nuts. And the tires have now been reinstalled. So that's all I need to do for this upgrade. You may have noticed I did not reinstall the ESC or the receiver. That's because they're bad. I have 2 fried ESCs, and I believe they are fried because of the receiver, because they both fried after I plugged them into this truck and this receiver. Another thing to note is if you put the button head screws into the back of the chassis deck, keep in mind I did just find the 3x12mm countersunk flathead screws. So if you have these, use them, because those are what you're supposed to put in. But I'm not going to undo it and fix it because I already put a ton of thread lock on these and it's holding in firmly, and that's what I want, because these screw ports are not in great shape. They're stripped out, so it's going to be more than it's worth to just switch them out. So leaving them alone is the best thing for me right now. But that's pretty much it for this upgrade. Now before I do end this upgrade, I do want to talk about the Tony Screws kit a little bit. This is not a complete review or anything. This is just kind of my first impression of it. Seems to be pretty good so far. I was not missing any screws. In fact, here are piles and piles of extra screws that I have. Some of which because I use stainless steel screws instead. Others because they just included like one extra, just in case, like this, just in case you lost one. I only needed 4 of these, but they included 5. So that's nice of them. Also, I did not have any of the screws stripped at all. All the screws held in firmly, and they are not stripped. So that is awesome. Some screws like to strip, and it's a pain in the butt to deal with. So the fact that these did not strip, that these just went right in where they're supposed to go, is amazing. But other than that, they seem to be pretty strong. They look pretty strong. They look really nice. I think. And the included stickers are a little silly, but that's alright. Ooh, you know, these could go on Scully. This would look really, really good on Scully. Anyway, yeah, so seems to be pretty good so far. So I'll let you know how they hold up to bashing, because we don't want them to bend either. But man, this looks like a proper, true Rustler VXL rolling chassis now. And that's awesome. A few down here. Transmission plate. So I think that's going to be it for this upgrade. And that was Dameon's level 3 upgrade.